fine, that's great.
So that's connected. Remember to press record.
I've done that.
Oh, okay. So I don't need to do anything?
No, this is running. Good evening and welcome to Birkbeck Science Week. My name is Nick Keep, I'm the Executive Dean of the School of Science. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's events from the Department of Psychological Sciences. After a drinks interval between 7 and 7:30, Alan Tierney will be talking on the song Illusion, and even if you haven't booked in, you're welcome to stay for that. But first, we have one of our most popular talks of the week from Professor Derakhshan on how can adaptive cognitive training improve resilience and mental well-being. Naz did a study with Michael Eysenck, a former Birkbeck academic who moved to Royal Holloway. She then set up her own group on a fellowship at Leeds before coming to Birkbeck about a decade ago. And she's had a very rapid rise up through the academic pathway to become professor a couple of years ago. And she's just redirected her research into this new area, and she's going to tell us about what she's now working on now.
Thank you very much, Nick. Just to be precise, it was 4 years ago when I was promoted to full professorship. So yeah, just to flag that up. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming to this talk. It's great to see so many people interested in this topic. As you can see, I'll be discussing what factors are relevant, are crucial to consider in our well-being, and how they relate to cognition, emotion, and so forth. So, as Nick said, I do head a lab, and recently this has been called the Risk and Resilience in Mental Health Laboratory. I thought I'd give you a snapshot of what we do before I dive into the research and get to the exciting stuff. So, in this laboratory, our main aims of the research we do is to look at the brain processes, the underlying cognitive and brain processes that are responsible for making us emotionally vulnerable to things like anxiety and depression, and how we can target those mechanisms to boost resilience and well-being. So why is it important to look at brain processes that can tell us about emotional vulnerability and help us direct our lives towards resilience? Because we want to protect against vulnerability, so protection and prevention is a key thing, and we want to develop better interventions that can enhance psychological flexibility towards resilience. So we use a multitude of measures, including eye movements, looking at brain responses, looking at behavioural responses, cognitive responses, to see how we can move towards resilience and protect against vulnerability. So, what I'd like you to take away from this lecture, and I'm going to give it to you now, is that I'd like you to conclude from this lecture that we are more emotionally vulnerable than we think we are. However, we are more resilient than we think we are. And vulnerability and resilience are actually two sides of the same coin. Without one, you cannot have the other. The emotional vulnerabilities that I'm going to be elaborating on today are anxiety and depression. So there have been various definitions of fear and anxiety. And one that I really like, that I use a lot in my lectures, is that fear is actually an adaptive response to a threatening or potentially threatening stimulus. And I'd like you to keep in mind that word adaptive, right? But fear has generally a negative connotation to it. Anxiety is that generalised fear without the potential threat, without the actual potential threat. And it becomes a a disorder when it's marked, when it's persistent and distressing to the individual. So it interferes with the daily functioning of what you do. There have been lots of symptomatologies that have been associated with anxious behaviour, and these come to no surprise to you. Your heart starts pounding, you sweat, you tremble, you're agitated, you're physiologically upset. For example, you've got knots in your stomach. You have poor concentration, distractibility is high, you tend to be biased towards negative thinking, and you're quite rigid in the way you see the world. There have been lots of anxiety disorders that have been documented in the literature, but some of the most common ones are, for example, panic disorder, fear of giving a public talk. I hope I don't have that one. And things like spider phobia or snake phobia, phobia of various crowds, dental phobia is a common one, fear of flying, fear of closed spaces, and fear of heights. So you've got that generalised anxiety, but you've also got specific anxiety disorders, which can be different from each other, but can share some underlying, the same underlying neural processes. As far as depression goes, lots of characteristics are comorbid with anxiety. For example, you know that associated with depression are disabilities like poor concentration, indecisiveness. You've got changes in sleep and energy levels, you feel fatigued, you feel low, and usually these symptoms have to persist for over 2 weeks to be marked and persistent to interfere with your daily lives. Depressed people often have feelings of guilt, shame and worthlessness, and definitely reduced self-esteem and reduced confidence, all of which interfere with what they want to do or what they prevent them from what they want to do in their daily lives. Now, interestingly, while depression has this negative connotation to it, some researchers have argued that depression actually presents an evolutionary paradox. Does sadness or extreme sadness serve an adaptive function? Do people run out of resources, and is depression a natural response to extreme loss, death of a loved one, failure, anticipation of negativity and so forth? So sadness can serve an adaptive response, but when it becomes persistent and when it becomes chronic and disabling, it can turn into major depression, chronic depression. But the roots of depression are still under question, so we don't know whether depression is actually a good and adaptive response to what has happened to us. Unfortunately, anxiety and depression are estimated to be the biggest cause of disability by 2025. They will be the second leading mental disorders by 2025. About 50 to 80% of people who have been diagnosed with a depression or anxiety disorder will continue to go on to have multiple episodes. They are classed as the most costly brain disorders in Europe, and there has been a recent rise in rates, especially in the younger population, in adolescents and children. We've seen children being clinically diagnosed with depression at the moment. Something that caught my eye yesterday was this, that 50 million years of work could be lost due to anxiety and depression. And by that, the researchers have argued that will be lost to mental illness, being anxiety and depression, each year to 2030. So anxiety and depression constitute a global burden that can interfere not only to these individuals' psychological health and well-being as an individual, but it can plague society, and this is the way that it will plague society. So we really need to understand the mechanisms behind these disorders, and see how we can target those mechanisms to protect against anxiety and depression. So, again, unfortunately, on a negative tone, we have not been able to identify the risk factors for these disorders. And they haven't been targeted, such risk factors, by psychopharmacological or therapeutic treatments. And there's an urgent need for translational research to invest more in understanding the cognitive mechanisms behind these disorders so that they can develop better treatments. This is what researchers are arguing. We need to understand what cognitive brain mechanisms underlie these disabling disorders so that we can develop better and new treatments. So, what are the cognitive characteristics of anxiety and depression? If it is so important for us to understand these cognitive mechanisms, we need to develop a richer understanding of the brain and physiological processes associated with them. So at the heart of depression and anxiety lies a very common process. Anxious people tend to worry and get engaged in cycles of worry. And especially when it comes to depression, depressed people are stuck in ruminative cycles of negative thinking. And anxiety and depression are both share a common characteristic, and that's intrusive thoughts, especially with post-traumatic stress disorder, when there is intrusions interfering in a habitual way, and the person finds it very difficult to snap out of that cycle and get on with what they're supposed to be doing. So worry and rumination are central characteristics, cognitive characteristics of anxiety and depression. Research has shown, and in fact lots of research from our lab has shown, that anxiety and depression are associated with a tendency, a preferential bias towards negativity. So anxious people tend to be drawn to negative material easier than non-anxious and depressed people, and they kind of get stuck on them, they dwell, and they find it difficult to disengage from the processing of these negative materials. Something that's quite common is avoidance. And you see this especially with some disorders, that, for example, socially anxious people will avoid giving a talk, will avoid eye contact. Why? Because it's too debilitating for them, because it's too disturbing for them. And so anxiety and depression is associated with avoidance, but this avoidance doesn't help. It backfires, it exaggerates the effects of anxiety and depression on behaviour. So there's no point me avoiding giving a public talk if I'm too scared and too apprehensive, because that avoidance links into chains of me being avoidant and moving away from that behaviour. So, for a number of years now, the work of my lab has been trying to understand how can we explain these cognitive features, these most prominent features behind anxiety and depressive vulnerability, through a common mechanism. Through a common mechanism which we believe is cognitive flexibility or attention control. So can this mechanism explain why is it that anxious and depressed people get stuck in these ruminative and worrisome thoughts and can't disengage? They have a tendency to shift towards negative information and avoid various kinds of situations that make them apprehensive and distressed. So what is attention control? There have been various definitions in the literature, but one that I favour most. Basically, we'll work from down upwards. Attention control is really processing efficiency. So it's the way in which we direct attention to and away from what's relevant and irrelevant. You do that every day. Even in, when you go to the supermarket, you try and remember what you've got to buy. I tend to forget a lot of the time, and then end up with things that I didn't go to buy, but nevertheless they're all very nice. So it's that flexibility by which I know what is relevant now, I need to attend to, and that negative thought, I need to put aside because it's not really conducive to what I'm doing now. So it's that plasticity, that what we refer to as processing efficiency. And a bit more jargon, because I'm a psychologist and I like to throw in these words. Attention control has been recognised as a prime feature of working memory capacity. By capacity, we don't mean size, the bigger my working memory. So working memory is this system in the brain that regulates incoming information and tells me what's relevant and what's irrelevant. Focus on this now, avoid that later, and so forth. So working memory capacity is quite an important term, if you like, and these have been used interchangeably. So sometimes people say working memory capacity if they want to refer to attention control or processing efficiency. It's that exercise, it's that process, really. So how can you measure attention control if it's such a cool concept, such an important concept to us in everyday life? You can measure attention control using lots of different methods that are quite popular in psychology research. But one that I'm very biased towards and I really like and I use a lot in the lab is called the anti-saccade task. And an anti-saccade task is the most simple version of the anti-saccade task, which has been around for quite a while actually, since 1978, was produced by someone called Hallett. Participants are instructed to look at a fixation cross that comes up on the screen and are asked to avoid looking at a blob that flashes up to either the left or right side of the screen and look to its mirror position on the screen ASAP, as soon as possible, very quick. So don't look at the blob, look away to its mirror position on the screen as quickly as possible. And performance on this task is usually compared with performance on a pro-saccade task. Participants are literally asked to look at the blob when it appears on the screen. So there's quite a bit of research to show that areas in the prefrontal parts of the brain which are implicated in attention control, activity in these areas right before the onset of the blob predicts how well I can look away from the blob and not look at it. So I'd like you to do a couple of these trials so that you can get a feel for how the anti-saccade tasks work. Are you all ready? Yeah? So, you need to look at the cross when it comes up and look away from the blob without looking at it, right? So it comes up here, you move your eyes from here to that side of the screen. Believe me, when I first was introduced to this task, I had to remind myself what I had to do all the time. So if I appear elementary, it's not my fault. So, you found that it was a bit difficult, or quite difficult, or not at all difficult. It depends on how well you exercise that, attention control process, that prefrontal mechanism that enabled you to execute that task. We've used that task a lot in anxiety research. Now I'm going to talk about a little bit about the theory and then come back to the anti-saccade task. So, how is attention control impaired in anxious and depressed people? And we're going to use that task to demonstrate how it was impaired. So, a few years ago, we developed something called the attention control theory of anxiety, and we've done a parallel one for depression as well. I'm quite proud to say that since 2007, I'm glad I got that number right, it's been cited over 1,600 times. And one of the most cited papers of all time since 2007. So we're quite proud of this. So we argued in that paper that anxiety impairs attention control by shifting the attentional system towards distractibility, so you're more stimulus driven, while reducing that goal-directed attention. So the attention system is really the most easiest sense made up of two systems. One that is stimulus driven, so very, very early processing and determines distractibility, and one that says, no, I've really got to focus on this goal and get this right. I'm not going to try and be shifting towards distraction. So anxiety disrupts this balance in favour of this and against this. And as a consequence, we have shown through brain imaging that anxious people have to try much harder to execute the goal by recruiting more cognitive resources because of this imbalance. So, if you think of the brain in this sense, so this is a very simple picture of the brain, and the red thing here, which is part of the limbic system, called amygdala, is supposed to be very sensitive to emotion processing, so stimulus-driven processes. So it's not firing when I see an angry face or I become scared. Fear and all kinds of different emotions actually affect the amygdala. When this is firing too much, as it is in anxious and depressed people, then the prefrontal mechanisms here, prefrontal mechanisms of control, find it difficult to dampen this activity. And so the connectivity between these systems becomes poor, becomes fragile. And this lack of connectivity, the fact that these two systems are not talking to each other properly, ends up in distractibility, lack of attention control, failed my exam, and all kinds of things, effects on behaviour. So we have shown that it is this communication that is faltered in anxious and depressed people. And interestingly, anxious people have to try much harder, recruit much more from here to do a task than non-anxious people. So people who report they're very high anxious or have a tendency to experience anxiety and depression over time and across various kinds of situations have this problem, as I explained before. Now, how did we show that compensatory effort? We got participants to do very high anxious people to do a version of this task. And we looked at brain activity right before the onset of the block. Okay, so I'm anticipating a block coming up, and I'm looking at brain activity here right before the onset of the block. So this is when the cross goes off, and this area demonstrates until the block comes on what's happening in the brain. And the blue lines, which seem to be the caption seems to be missing, are the high anxious, and the red ones are the low anxious people. Who was selected based on a trait anxiety questionnaire. The more negativity here, which indicates more activity in prefrontal areas, was evident for the high anxious people relative to the low anxious people. In terms of errors, the two groups didn't make it, there weren't any different, but high anxious people had to recruit more to reach the same level of behavioural performance as the low anxious people did. And this shows the hidden cost of anxiety and depression on processing efficiency. Now, why is this the case? Why is it so difficult for anxious and depressed people to do this? And why do they have to engage in compensatory effort? We have shown that this is because of worry and rumination. So when anxious people and depressed people are worrying and they're ruminating about various things, these worrisome thoughts use up limited resources of working memory and leave fewer available to do the task. We're limited in capacity as human beings. We don't have endless capacity. And when you clog that working memory with all kinds of negative thoughts and worrisome thoughts, without even being aware of it, you leave little that can be applied to what you do. You become forgetful, distracted, and so forth. So the more you worry and ruminate, the less you have in terms of working memory capacity. You reduce processing efficiency, you reduce working memory capacity. And in a recent study, we have shown that this need not be restricted to high anxious people, people with emotional vulnerability. If you get a population who score low to normal on questionnaires that identify people as anxious or depressed, and get them to worry about a particular event in the future, you reduce their working memory capacity. And this paper, in fact, came out online yesterday, which I'm quite proud, and immediately the science blogs like to pick on the work we do and flash up, you know, various, you know, in their blog, various publicity in terms of the social media. And this work was done by one of my PhD students, Sari. So this was the first time we'd shown that worrying impairs working memory capacity. And just to kind of give you a handful of results, not just us, but there are lots of studies using different measures that show anxiety and depression are associated with reduced working memory capacity. Now, the $6 million question is this. What's the chicken and the egg here? Is it anxiety that reduces attention control, or is it attention control that has a causal effect on increasing anxiety, reduced attention control? The relationship is very bidirectional. However, we have shown that if attention control can be regarded as a causal mechanism for vulnerability and resilience, if this can be demonstrated, then it can be targeted to reduce vulnerability and boost resilience. In psychology research, we get a lot of correlations between this and that, you know, lots of findings are very spectacular and interesting and so forth, but little do we know about cause and effect. And that's why we do experiments, because we want to manipulate a process and look at the effect on behaviour. Once you establish a causal mechanism, then you're kind of a few steps ahead. Yeah? So, in recent years, we've been trying to establish attention control as a causal mechanism of vulnerability and resilience. Now, aside from the clinical implications, which are huge, there are loads of educational implications. Why? Because, again, we're involved in a project that has shown reduced processing efficiency can predict longer-term underachievement in anxious and depressed students in schools, for adolescents in schools. And in another study, which is a really nice study actually, working memory capacity, what we talked about earlier, has shown to mediate the relationship between anxiety and educational outcomes. If it's mediating, then it can be regarded as somewhat of a causal mechanism. If it's mediating, it means it's responsible, mostly, for that relationship. So if I boost working memory capacity and attention control, I can reduce the effects of anxiety on performance, yeah? I can hopefully protect against the development of anxiety effects on performance. And then we're rocking. So, how can we improve attention control? This is not an easy task. And like every other thing in psychology research that took a while to kind of make its way through, this as well needs time to make its way through. So you must have heard about these brain training games. Yes, these brain training games that are supposed to affect your cognitive processes, make you smarter. Yeah, you've heard lots about brain training apps and things. Yeah. Now, quite a lot of those apps or brain training games, people get really good on the task itself. There's no transfer. So that skill that you have perfected using that training hasn't really benefited much of what you do in real life. Yeah? What we want to do is to train working memory, or executive processing working memory, attention control, so that we can hopefully, through carefully designed and tailored interventions, look at the effect on executive processes on other tasks, yeah? And in some ways, we want to use this to reduce anxiety and depression and boost resilience. So we have big ambitious aims, and we are at the beginning of this road, but with promising results so far. There's a lot yet to be achieved. So one of the working memory training tasks that we have developed and tailored was originally introduced by Suzanne Yagi in 2008. She showed that training on this task can improve fluid intelligence. Oh, that's a big claim to make, but it was made and it was replicated, and in a very recent review in 2015, the effect size for that was good, was reliable. I'm going to trip heavily. Distracted. Or too excited. So here it's been argued that training improves working memory capacity from continuous engagement of executive processes. So it really hinges on your prefrontal mechanisms of control and inhibition, flexibility, so that it exercises those processes. If you think of the brain as a muscle, which it is really, you train it carefully and you'll see the results. But the key thing is that the training benefits should transfer. If it doesn't, I'm not interested. So, this is called an adaptive dual end-back. Why is it dual? Because people do two things on the task. Your task is to match stimuli on a current trial to that of presented a set number of trials back in a sequence. So you can have a 1 back, or a 2 back, or a 3 back, and as the n goes up, the task becomes more difficult. The task is tailored to be adaptive based on your performance. So if you hit a level of good performance, then the next block will be a 2 back and 3 back. And if you don't, you stagger like I do, and then you get worse, then it comes back to a level lower. And I always find that really encouraging. For me. So I would like you to do an example of a 1 back task so that you can get a feel. Yeah, we'd like to get a feel. So the point is to match the characteristics of a trial to that 1 back. Yeah, so 1 back, the previous trial. You've got to do this for some letters that are spoken and the position of the grid. Okay, let's go.
S H K.
So there you saw a position match, yeah? No letter match. Yeah or no? Yeah? Brilliant. So we've started a series of studies looking at how we can use and tailor this task for vulnerable individuals suffering from anxiety, suffering from high levels of worry, suffering from subclinical levels of depression. And this study that I'll talk to you about, we adapted the dual end-back for subclinically depressed individuals. So at pre-intervention, participants came into the lab and they completed some tasks where we measured their brain function in terms of working memory capacity. So we looked at how their brain was responding on a task that measured working memory capacity that I'll show you in a minute. Then we had them in 2 groups randomly assigned to. An adaptive training group that goes up in difficulty or comes down in difficulty, and a control group that staggers on the 1 back that doesn't improve or doesn't go up and down. Training studies need appropriate active control groups. Otherwise, we're in a bit of a problem. And they did this for 8 days online from home where their performance was monitored. And then within 24 hours, they came back to the lab and we retested on those measures that were tested at pre-intervention. So we wanted to see whether this training affected working memory capacity. Did it increase it or not? So the working memory task that they did, where we measured brain responses, was a simple change detection task, which is shown to be quite sensitive to the amount of information people hold in working memory and the amount of information they can exclude. So you need to remember the orientation of the red rectangles. Then there's a gap, and then you need to say if one of them changed in orientation or not. Sometimes there's a change, sometimes there isn't. We don't know what percentage. So I'd like you to actually do a couple of trials so you get a feel for the task. So there was change in the second one, yes? And not in the other two. So the arrow, which I forgot to say what it indicated, you needed to attend to the side of the screen where the arrow was pointing without moving your eyes from the cross. Whoops. Well, we need to repeat the experiment now. But now we should move on. So at pre-intervention, the training and the control group were matched on the measures of working memory capacity as they responded on the keyboard to say whether change was present or not, and on a measure of filtering efficiency which showed brain responses. So both of them matched at pre-intervention. The training group improved on the training task. So level of N went up from here, from day 1 to day 8, showing the participants were doing the task, they were engaged in it, and they improved. But did this improvement transfer? And yes, it did. So what you see above the line is an increase in working memory capacity at post versus pre, so it's a difference score. We found that relative to the control group, there was a difference on the behavioural and on the neural measure. Now, the key thing to take away from all this is that what participants were tested on, that outcome measure, was very different to the EMBAC. Yeah? The change detection task is very different to the EMBAC. So this transfer isn't about strategy learning, which most brain training games focus on. It's about a shift in a natural process improvement. It's a shift in the ability. So the training affected in ability, working memory capacity. In a similar study, we looked at how we could target subclinically anxious participants through this exact same training like I discussed before. And there were participants, very anxious participants, subclinically anxious, but now we got them to train for more than 8 days, 15 days. So half an hour daily for 15 days over 3 weeks. That's a lot. Gosh, we're lucky. And this is tailored. So we have run many experiments to see what length of training is feasible and works. We reduce and we increase as per the population under investigation. But here we use other types of cognitive and neural measures, like the anticipate task. We used another change detection task and so forth. And we looked at electrophysiological responses. This graph shows that the training group got better and better. So level of N went up from day 1 to day 15. Did this transfer, this improvement? So this is a very crude slide looking at, again, crude measurement just for demonstration purposes. This is the neural measure, and it looks again, post versus pre. The training group gained more in terms of neural efficiency versus the control group, who surprisingly got worse. And in terms of inhibition, we found much better inhibitory control as measured by interference reductions from distractibility and inhibitory control in the training group versus the control group. So this is kind of just showing off the training group benefited more than the control group. The control group were fine. They were on the one back task. They were hitting 90%, 95%. They were doing the training right. But because it wasn't adaptive and there was no improvement, there was nothing to transfer really. So we improved processing efficiency. And again, the outcome measures were very different to the training measures. And the icing on the cake came here, where level of engagement with training from beginning to end. So this is the beginning, where they were at on N and where they finished at day 15. How much they improved on the training predicted lower levels of anxiety, trait vulnerability to anxiety after the intervention. So the more you're engaged with the training task, the lower your levels of anxiety were in terms of vulnerability on the questionnaire, post versus pre. Now this is the first demonstration of a direct effect of cognitive training on emotion. So it's going from cognition to emotion, and to make that link is huge. It's preliminary, very infancy days, and this needs to be replicated, but it's in the promising direction. And this, in fact, this article got huge media coverage by the BPS. It had 501 shares in just a matter of a few days when it came out. So this is again just to show off that the British Psychological Society, which is a very the most well-known psychological society in the UK, picked on it as soon as it was out and flagged it up, and other science blogs as well were talking about it. So, as we are very ambitious, we like to think ahead of ourselves and think, okay, so we've managed to increase processing efficiency that then has a correlation with reduced anxiety levels. Okay, so processing efficiency, engagement, concentration, focused attention. You really need to be focused while you're doing the training task. So perhaps we can use this training task to, alongside other traditional therapies, to improve their effectiveness. You think about a course of mindfulness, very popular. Yeah, we all know what mindfulness is. It's everywhere. What does mindfulness involve? Focused attention. I need to focus on my thoughts, push everything away. I'm very bad at doing that. Mindfulness relies on prefrontal mechanisms of control. You need to be good at concentrating, right? And for mindfulness courses are what, like 8 weeks? For someone who's quite depressed and is subject to distractibility, they're not going to, we want them to sustain their adherence to the mindfulness course, but we know many drop out. What can we do to help sustain the longer term effectiveness of things like cognitive behaviour therapy, CBT, mindfulness, and so forth? So we ran a study. This is under review at the moment. It's got good reviews, so I'm hoping it's going to get published. We selected people who were very high on levels of worry. So again, using questionnaire on worrying, we selected the top scale of the top quartile of people who were high worriers. Again, at pre-intervention, they came in and did some of the tasks as I just showed you. And then we had 4 groups. We looked at the independent and combined effects of the impact and mindfulness. We wanted to see whether the combined group, the group who did both, what did they look like compared to the ones who were doing separately. We had another aspect to it, to this design, and you must be wondering, well, what about the longer term effects of these training protocols? Do they disappear in a week? Do they disappear in 2 weeks? We tested them again after 1 week. So we had immediate and after 1 week. So the groups who did the dual MBAC, we need to make sure that there's improvement. If there isn't, I'm not particularly enthusiastic about looking at group differences or engagement with training, predicting changes in vulnerability. So there is improvement, both groups go up, we're happy. This graph shows levels of self-reported worry using that questionnaire I discussed earlier, pre-intervention, post-intervention, and 1 week follow-up. Everyone's levels of worry goes down post-intervention, but the group that has a sustained and even goes further down is the group who did the combined training. Yeah? So if you look at mindfulness alone, they went back up again, or they leveled. But combined with MBAC, more reduction in worry at 1 week follow-up. Again, these results are preliminary, but they're saying something to us that this needs more work and more go ahead with it. Now, interestingly, again, training improvements, so the level of engagement you had with the MBAC task predicted or was correlated with reductions of worry post versus pre-intervention. So the more you engage with the training, the less low your levels of worry. And the more you engaged with training, the greater your levels of resilience were at post-follow-up. So participants completed a measure of resilience as well, questionnaire. So engagement with training was associated with reductions in worry and improvements in levels of resilience. Very interestingly, changes in resilience immediately after the intervention were correlated with reductions in worry at 1 week follow-up. So the more resilient you became as a function of the training, the lower your scores on worry, the less worried you were in terms of trait vulnerability to worry at 1 week follow-up. So this is again trying to give you an effect of cognition affecting emotion, which is very important. So we have extended this line of work. I'm going to say just a little bit about some of the current projects that we're running. We're looking at how various kinds of training methods can improve tennis performance. Gosh, that's a bit of a leap, isn't it? But when you have very enthusiastic PhD students like Manu, who's also a tennis coach and he's sitting there, he wants to see how you can train attention control to improve performance in the field, to improve tennis sports. You've got lots of act under pressure, yeah? Anxiety levels can be very high, can be prone to distractibility. So there he is, playing tennis. And here he is testing. And this PhD studentship is supported by an ESRC grant. And he's already actually collected quite a lot of his data. But he's also looking at eye movements, not with the anticipate, but also other types of eye movement indices, something that's called the quiet eye. And it's supposed to be the length of the last fixation of the eye before an action is generated towards a goal. And apparently anxiety reduces the length of the quiet eye and makes you susceptible to distraction. So he's trying to see if he trains attention control, can he lengthen that length of the fixation, the quiet eye, to reduce the effects of like choking, under pressure and so forth. And he's got some nice results so far that I'm only going to touch on. So for example, in a training study, he has seen that training can make anti-saccade latencies much faster, pre-intervention to post-intervention, in the training group versus the control group. So people, it's not just looking at what things happen in the field, you need to show the mechanism by which a change is produced. So we look at how training affects cognitive performance on various tasks, as well as the field. So when independent raters rated how better people were, tennis players were, whilst performing post-intervention, they rated that they had more gains on various types of measurements that they use in the tennis world compared to the control group. And interestingly, a recent finding has been also looking at how improvement on training, how engagement with the training can be related to the lower number of errors, so missed rate reductions. And it looks like there is a perfect correlation there, as far as I can see. So the more you improve, the lower the rate of missed shots. But of course, this is all very complicated for me, and he knows better in terms of the exact details of the study. And we are at the early stages of this research, but again, with lots of potential, and the London Tennis Association is also interested, and so forth. So, can we apply this work to really vulnerable individuals? And we have, in a very ambitious way, started looking at how we can boost resilience and reduce vulnerability in survivors of breast cancer. And my lovely PhD student who's pursuing this work, Jess, has been awarded funding, and we've got funding from an ISSF Wellcome Trust, thank you Nick for supporting that, to run an ambitious longitudinal study looking at how cognitive training, using variants of the tasks that I just described, can improve resilience in terms of reductions in emotional vulnerability that's cancer-related in survivors of breast cancer. Breast cancer is a horrific silent disease that affects about 57,000 people in the UK every year. And about 2/3 of women who are diagnosed with breast cancer are affected with post-traumatic stress disorder due to the psychological impact of cancer diagnosis and cognitive decline that follows treatment, and of course the shock of the diagnosis. So breast cancer survivorship is a very critical thing for us to consider, and what we want to do is to improve the quality of life and in this population and reduce the emotional vulnerability to anxiety and depression that hits over 40% of this population. So Jess has had some very preliminary results, again through training. So this is a small study that we did with breast cancer care and breast cancer survivors. This is a very small study, so we didn't look at type and grade, etc. But this is just a snapshot of the fact that it can be applied to this population, and they do improve on the training task. And such improvements are associated with lower cancer-related intrusions and negative thoughts due to treatments and diagnosis. So cancer-related thoughts, which can be quite debilitating in this population, are reduced post-training as a function of engagement with the task. And very interestingly, the effect is stronger at 1 month follow-up. Why do we think the effect is stronger at 1 week follow-up, or 1 month follow-up? Why do you think it's stronger at 1 month follow-up? You'd expect all these effects to go away. Yeah? How can such a training exert such a long-term influence? It's due to training affecting grey and white matter in the brain. The brain is plastic, and we've shown that. And you need time to consolidate these changes with ever-changing environmental demands. So people apply indirectly the benefits of training, this focused concentration, improved attention control, over time in various situations, various settings, and the effects seem to be stronger after a lapsed period. And this isn't just true for this training. I think that there were other studies on cognitive behaviour therapy that also showed that therapies that engage prefrontal mechanisms or rely on prefrontal mechanisms need time to consolidate those changes with the environment. So we have a centre for building psychological resilience in breast cancer. We're still a Facebook group, but we hope to expand and hopefully have a centre, a real centre for that one day, and I am pretty confident that will happen. In the centre we have a private psychoeducational group that's directed by myself, and we have had over 350 members in just under 5 months. And the members showcase their growth from the trauma that they've endured through workings of art, science and writing. And this is open to everyone to see. It's not a Facebook group. It's not a Facebook page, it's a Google page, I think. So just to sum up then, just to recap, because I've gone over time, training has shown promise for cognitive flexibility. Why do we need it? Because we want to enhance treatment efficacy and we want to protect against vulnerability. Just think of this scenario. If working memory capacity could be used as a protective marker very early on in childhood, then perhaps we can prevent some of the debilitating effects of anxiety and depression on performance in adolescence. And why do we want this? Because we want to have a better quality of life and we want to foster resilience. Now, I've just got three more slides on resilience. There is a lot of controversy over what resilience is. So when I started learning about resilience, I thought, oh, it's about toughness, I better avoid or inhibit, I'm tough, ignore, yeah, I'm resilient, nothing can affect me. But then I learned that actually, resilience depends on the ability to experience a multitude of emotions, express them, and modify them according to context. That is resilience. It's that plasticity. It's that, when you push like a spring thing down and then it bounces up. It's that velocity by which you bounce up and come back again. And in a very nice study, this goes back years ago, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, those individuals who could express and modify their responses according to the trauma that they endured were actually better adjusted health-wise at 2 years follow-up. And we want to go as far as to say, if you can embrace your fears, love your sadness, and embrace your loss, that can actually be conducive to flexibility, adaptability, and strength. It's not just that I can ignore and I can inhibit. When people feel fearful, what do we say to them? I find myself saying, look, pull yourself together, ignore it. You can do better, think positive. So why do we need attention control? Not to be able to be good at inhibiting and avoiding, but to be able to experience and express these emotions, these negative emotions, adaptively. Why? Because we want to be open and curious. And to be like that, you need good processing efficiency. And we want to be adjusted because we want to have better meaning in life. We want to gratitude and grit are two words that I use a lot in my research, and that I think that attention control, through its effects on cognitive flexibility and resilience, can give us that. So I want to end by saying, or by this famous saying, by Charles Darwin that it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And that's what we're trying to promote, that plasticity for change. So some of the people who were instrumental, without these people, none of the work that I described could happen. And some of them have gone on for very famous fellowships and jobs elsewhere, doing better and more exciting things. Some of the funders, who used to be quite generous in the past funding us, but not so much in the present. And it's getting tougher. So, and Department of Psychological Sciences, according to an issue that the name escapes me, we are 5th in the UK, but recently we were ranked 5th in the world as well. Obviously because of the research we do. And thank you so much for listening.
Questions for now? Yep.
Hello. Does the background of the person and the root cause of their anxiety make any difference to how effective it is? So somebody have you done any research on sort of social, economical background and all of those things? Do they matter?
They do matter, and we have to consider those actually. But we've really been trying to establish the efficacy of the training so far. So these interventions just kind of say, well, yes, it works, it transfers, but let's see what it's modulated by will be the next step. So socioeconomic status and background, especially so with women who are affected by breast cancer. A number of factors need to be taken into account: the time from diagnosis, what current medication they're on, and so forth. We're looking at that now. But the general population, yes, we need to look at those. They're definitely affected, definitely. And what we have found is that the more vulnerable you are, the more benefit you get from the training. So if you, statistically, there's more room to improve, but it's more meaningful to train someone who's vulnerable than someone who's kind of there already, you know. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just recently diagnosed with depression and anxiety.
Okay.
And sometimes it's hard to express my feelings. So when we say adaptability, is it the same as acting? So if you're really sort of without be like smiling or
No, actually, it's the opposite of that. It's to allow yourself to experience what you're experiencing. In some ways, it's trying to be mindful of what the way you are, and there are reasons for feeling the way you are, and so it's coming to terms with them. And what we find, the pressure to be positive when you are diagnosed with something like anxiety or depression, it's overwhelming, and it's not really conducive to be smiling when you have very good reason to be sad. So it's very interesting. People who do end up, the research that I just flagged up in the last few slides, people who do end up embracing those levels of sadness and fear actually find that after a while they're not as threatening to them as they thought that they would be, and they feel more adjusted and adapted. So it's kind of a pressure to put aside and move away, and that is counterproductive. Yeah, it's hard. It's very hard to come to terms, because those feelings are quite painful. But slowly, I think, little by little. Yes.
I just wondered how many of your participants were adolescents, and if there was a difference in them.
I know. The studies that I talked to you about, no adolescents, but we have just completed a study in one of the London schools on adolescents. I think it's 11 to 16 or 17-year-olds. And we're looking at levels of how levels of anxiety and depression modulate the training effects and so forth. But the real aim there is to to see how the training can, have a transfer effect on academic standards, as well as like comprehension tests, like reading comprehension tests and so forth. From what we've heard, just from self-reports, is that it's very interesting. Some of them have said things like, I think that I'm much more focused, I'm more concentrated, and funnily enough, it's helped with my eating as well. So someone who, a girl who had a tendency to binge has now, we weren't looking at that at all, but she has made a remark about how the training has reduced her binging behaviour, which is very, again, it shows scope for doing work with eating tendencies and so forth. Yes?
Can I have the training? A. And B, I know it's early days, but the future of this, is the future of this like going into hospitals, mental hospitals, specialist treatment, mental hospitals, eating disorders, BPD, that sort of thing, and adding the training onto the therapy that's currently on offer?
I think that would be our really ambitious aim to do that.
To think that that's a possibility.
Because people will get more benefit from the current therapies that they're under. This is by no means a therapy.
No, but it would make some of like DBT therapies, far more
effective. Yes, that's true. We're hoping, but we need to publish first to show that these effects are there, they can be replicated, hopefully sustained, and once we're a bit more down the line, we can. So far it's going really well, and lots of encouraging and promising feedback and support from the academic field. And in cancer care, it's making its way more. But for other disorders, I'm not so sure. We have to try and test. But I think the idea is that when you think of training, it's a very delicate issue, because what is the aim of training? And I think the aim of training is to improve an underlying ability. And that underlying ability could be, it is attention control. And then you would think, well, okay, if I train this, will I see a spillover to more specific processes? Some people like to train just one process, like inhibition or distractibility, so they can come up with a design that could just train a specific process, and that's absolutely fine. But then you run into dangers of, promoting strategies for that specific process. But I think both are okay as long as the training is adapted and tailored well. When we started out this research, we actually thought, me personally, I thought that there is no way that people who are subclinically depressed can do this training over 8 days across 2-week period. We had very few dropouts. They showed immense improvement on the training, and it transferred. And then with the anxiety, and now with the breast cancer population, we are seeing effects. It's kind of very encouraging and motivating, and the auditory kind of keeps you going. And people say, oh yes, I really want to go on to fall back and through that. I really want to get there, So they're very motivated to kind of do it, which gives them a sense of empowerment. If you give the effects of therapy, at the end of the day, you want to make the patient feel empowered, that they can, they're able to. They don't rely on a prescription. Or, even if it's CBT, it's still quite prescriptive. Go away and, do this homework and da. So it's giving the person that sense of empowerment that they can. Some feedback we're getting from the breast cancer population actually is very interesting. Some of them have said things like, we never knew we existed until we did this training. And we have discovered that what was lacking from our lives was a challenge. And we look forward to, to doing this and so forth. So when they are highly affected by trauma. So it's trying to, it is simple, it's online, you don't rely on someone to kind of push you through. It's still early days, but there is some promise There is some promise.
So at 7:30 there's a talk by Dr. Adam Tierney on the speech song illusion. Until then there's refreshments outside, so do go and help yourself, and you join us at 7:30.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.